Today we're going to be looking at painting using a monochromatic color scheme. I'm going to be starting by blocking in the basics of my image using the darkest tone that I plan on using, which is the pure blue that I'm using here. You can see that I'm working on cardboard, mostly because I want you guys to get comfortable with a larger size, but also to not treat your work as quite so precious. Now I'm blocking these in. I'm just roughly defining the darkest shapes in those areas so I can know where they are before I start beginning to add in details. You can see that some of my lines are quite sketchy as I'm going. This is allowing me to rough what I want to work on, and I'll refine it later in the painting process. My next step after the darks is to start identifying light areas. So now I'm going to add some white on my brush, and you can see my brush is still dirty. I haven't washed it, so a little bit of the blue is still shining through. And I'm starting to define the brighter areas on this section of bone that I'm doing and identify where those are so I can block in more of the shape. Right now I'm just focusing on sections of color blocking, and I'm not concerned about applying naturalistic values. I just want to get a rough idea of where everything is, and then I'll go in slowly and add in more detail to define all the bumps and contortions on this object. Now, for those of you who aren't clear, I am painting a section of a skeleton, the hip bones, and I'll be adding a little bit of the spine as well. So I'm trying to capture all those undulations and textures throughout this section of bone. So I'm still adding in some of the light areas and adding in some definition here and there to try to make sure everything is in the right location. One of the great things about acrylic paint is that it layers very easily and blocks off the layer below, so as you make mistakes you can just go over the next section. Now I'm starting to add in the spine now that I have the basic structure of my painting done. So I'm painting in the section of the spine that I can see through the gap in the hip bone, and then we'll carry on with the rest of the spine. I'm starting to go into the image with a brighter white to help define the really bright spots on the bone, the areas that are highlighted in my original source image that I'm using from the app Essential Skeleton 4. Next, I'm going to start defining some of the darkest areas by mixing in the complementary color of the paint that I'm using. So since the main color I'm using is blue, I've mixed in the very tiniest amount of orange, and you can see that has caused a sort of bluish gray color that I'm using to define the absolute darkest areas in my painting. I'm only using a very limited amount of orange to get to those darker colors, and it's really about control in this regard when you're using complementary colors. Lastly, I'm beginning to find a little bit of frustration with how dry the paint is getting. Acrylic paint dries so fast. So I start mixing in some acrylic gel medium, and that allows me to get a smoother finish on the details that I'm doing with this fine brush. Acrylic gel medium is blended in small amounts just to improve the viscosity or the smoothness, the ability for the paint to move across the surface.